Hello class, welcome to lesson 2-4, which is all about multiplying integers. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to multiply integers and simplify algebraic expressions. So the last couple days we've spent talking about adding and subtracting integers. Now we're going to talk about the multiplication rules. Okay, so if I asked you, what is 17 times 2? I'm going to use this symbol to represent multiplication because it's the easiest one to type right now. A little star. Okay, so 17 times 2. If I did that, I would end up with 34. And then, if I ask you, what happens if I do 54 times a negative 3? Well, you maybe remember from the last couple of years you've learned that when you have a positive times a negative, that you end up with a negative answer. So positive times negative means that my answer is going to be negative. And then I just multiply like normal. 54 times 3. And 54 times 3 is 162. Okay. And then if I have a negative 16 times a negative 4, so negative times a negative. Sorry, I tried to do a multiplication symbol. Didn't work very well. Negative times a negative, I end up with a positive. So I know negative 16 times negative 4 is the same as 16 times 4, which is 64. You end up with a positive. Okay, and then I have a positive 9 times a negative 3. And we looked at that right up above. Positive times a negative gives me a negative answer, and 9 times 3 gives me 27. Okay? So let's make sure we write down those rules. If we have a positive times a positive, our answer is always positive. If I have a negative times a negative, the answer is positive. If I have a negative times a positive or a positive times a negative, so one of each, the answer is a negative. So if you're someone that's constantly mixing those up, one way that sometimes helps people remember, if the signs are the same, meaning they're both positive or they're both negative, that means your answer is going to be positive. But if you have one of each, your answer is going to be negative. Okay, so maybe that'll help you keep it straight a bit. Now let's talk about multiplying when we have more than 2 integers, okay? So if we look at this first one, if I have 3 times negative 4 times 5, the cool thing about multiplication, it doesn't matter what order you multiply in. So I can choose to multiply 3 times negative 4 first. And if I do that, I have a positive times the negative. So that means that I'm going to end up with a negative. And 3 times 4 is 12. And then I still have that 5 that I have to multiply by. So now I have a negative 12 times a positive 5. So I know my answer is going to be negative. And 12 times 5 is 60. So I have a negative 60. Okay, this next one, I have a negative 9 times 6. So a negative 9 times a positive 6 gives me a negative. And 9 times 6 is 54. And then I'm multiplying negative 54 times negative 2. So I have 2 negatives. They're both the same sign. That means my answer is going to be positive, and 54 times 2 is 108. Okay, then why don't you go ahead and try this next one on your own. 6 times negative 2 times 7. Hopefully you ended up at a positive 84. If not, maybe double check your work or ask me for some help. I want you to try this last one on your own. Good luck. Hopefully for the last one you ended up at 297. Again, if you have any questions on how to get to that answer, please let me know, and I'm more than happy to assist you. Okay, so let's talk about what happens when we multiply all positive integers. So if I go back a screen, looking for an example where I had every single number positive, that would be this example right down here. I have a positive 9 times a positive 11 times a positive 3. Everything's positive, so my answer is going to remain positive. Now, multiplying an odd number of negative integers, so having 1 or 3 or even 5, 7, all of the odd numbers, multiplying an odd number of negative integers results in what kind of answer? So if I look at this first example, I have 1 negative, and I ended up with a negative answer. And then the other two examples have even numbers of integers. So whenever you multiply even number of negative integers, I'm not sure if that's what I said, just need to double check. So multiplying an odd number of negative integers results in a negative answer. So if I did 2 times negative 3 times negative 4 times negative 7, I have 1, 2, 3 negatives. That means my final answer would be negative. Okay? If there's an odd number of negatives, then your answer is negative. If you have an even number of negative integers, so if we go back to that screen again, you can see I had 2 negatives here, and I ended up at a positive 84. And I had 2 negative integers to start here, and I ended up at a positive. So if you have an even number of negative integers, so whether that's 2, 4, 6, doesn't matter as long as it's even number, you end up with a positive answer. Okay? Now, let's talk about what it looks like to simplify things. So if we look at this first one, I have 14a on the outside of parentheses, and then inside parentheses, I have a negative 9b. So the way that we simplify, start by looking at your regular numbers and multiply those together. So what's 14 times negative 9? It's a positive times a negative, so I'm going to have a negative, and 14 times 9 is 126. Then you want to look and say, I have an a and a b. Those two variables are different, so I can't combine them like I did the numbers. So I'm just going to carry each of them down, and they become part of my answer. So my simplified answer there is negative 126ab. Okay, so we're going to do a similar thing over here. So if I start right here, I'm going to look at my negative 2 times positive 6. Negative times a positive is a negative. Or if I want, I can look at all of my numbers together. And I can say, okay, I have 2 negative numbers. And when I have 2 negatives, that's an even number of negative numbers. So my final answer is going to be positive. So then I can do 2 times 6 times 5 times 3. Because I know my answer is going to be positive. So that ends up giving me 180. And then I can look and say, okay, I have an M, N, P, and R. None of those repeat, so I'm just going to write all of them right after the number. Okay, so you guys are going to practice simplifying those numbers for the most part. All right, and then if I ask you to evaluate something, if I gave you evaluate if C equals 8, D equals negative 2, and F equals negative 3, I have 7 times 8, and if you want to write it like this, that's okay, times D equals negative 2. Don't forget the negative. So you can write it either way. It says the same thing. So I have one negative, so I know my answer will be negative. And then 7 times 8 times 2 gives me 112. Why don't you go ahead and try to solve the next one on your own? Good luck. Hopefully you looked at that one and you said, I have 3 negatives, so that's an odd number of negatives. And an odd number of negatives results in a negative answer. So I write down a negative. And then 3 times 8 times 2 times 3 leaves me with 144. So my final answer is negative 144. If you have questions on that at all, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to help you. Have a good day.